Hi everyone! Today we're starting a super simple but really fun quilt block, and we're making it with foundation paper piecing, or FPP. If you've been wanting to try FPP but it felt a little scary, this is a great first block. It's quick, clean, and there are only 2 seams, so you can focus on the method without getting overwhelmed. You can download the template under this video, or you can draw it yourself. All you need is a square, any size you like. I'm keeping it relaxed. I'm using a sheet of notebook paper, and I'm trimming it into a square without measuring. The design is just 2 straight lines, from one corner to the center, and then from the center to the opposite corner. I find the center point, grab a ruler, and draw those lines. If you're using the printable template, just download it and print it out. I also like to label the colors right on the paper, even on simple blocks, so I don't get mixed up later. Next, I pre-fold the paper on the printed seam lines. This makes everything easier when we start joining pieces. I'm using a thin ruler, but anything works. A postcard, a gift card, any piece of cardstock. Okay, prep is done. Now we attach fabric to section 1. For FPP, I love using scraps from other projects. I cut a piece that fully covers section 1 with a little extra around the edges just to be safe. You can pin the first piece and trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. That works. But most of the time I use a regular glue stick from a stationery store. Just a tiny swipe on the paper. We're not trying to glue it permanently, we just want the fabric to stay in place while we sew. One quick note before we sew. The printable template already includes a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Everything you need is printed right on the paper. But you'll notice I still cut my fabric a bit bigger than the section. I don't trim right on the line yet, and that's on purpose. I like having a little extra fabric just in case something shifts while I'm sewing. We'll do the clean, perfect trim at the very end. After the block is fully pieced, I'll press it flat with a dry iron, and then I'll trim the whole block right on the printed outer line. And one more thing. If you drew this block yourself on notebook paper, there's no seam allowance yet. So just remember to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside. I still leave a little extra fabric here too. It just makes it easier to piece everything together, press it flat, and then trim off the extra at the end. Once fabric 1 is in place, I'm ready to move to the sewing machine, and I'll stitch all the prepared blocks in one go. Okay, let's start sewing. Section 2 is pink in my block, so first I prep the fabric. I place my paper template on top and make sure the pink fabric covers section 2 with extra room on all sides, just to be safe. Then I cut a strip that's the right width. I like cutting one long strip so I can sew all my prepared blocks in one go, instead of cutting a new piece every time. One little FPP tip. Sometimes a dark fabric can show through a lighter fabric along the seam. To help prevent that, I don't line my fabrics up perfectly edge to edge. I offset them just a bit, so the lighter fabric slightly overlaps the darker fabric's raw edge. After the paper comes off, it looks much cleaner. Now I stitch the seam line. I start sewing a little before the printed line begins, and I stop a little after it ends, at least a 1/4 inch past the line. Once section 2 is sewn, I fold the paper on the next line and trim away the excess fabric. You can use a ruler and trim straight to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I usually do a quick rough cut with scissors first, then I tidy everything up with a ruler back at the table. It's faster for me. I sew all the blocks first, then press them, and then trim them neatly. In the video, I'll sometimes flip the fabric back so you can clearly see the coverage and the extra fabric around the section. In real life, I do that less. I just cut my strip wide enough with a little extra and keep moving. And I do the same thing with the block we drew by hand. I test the fabric, make sure I have extra coverage, sew on the line, and trim with some extra room. And remember, the hand-drawn template has no outer seam allowance. So I leave extra fabric around the outside edges, so there's still room later for trimming and for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now it's time to press the seam and get ready for the next section. First, I give the seam a little heat so it settles down nicely. Then I gently fold the fabric back with my fingers and press it with the iron. I try not to drag the iron across the fabric too much. I just press, lift, move, and press again. For me, that usually gives a flatter seam and a cleaner result. Next, I trim the excess fabric along the edge between sections 2 and 3, leaving a 1/4-inch seam allowance. The extra fabric around the outside edges of the block can stay for now. I'm only trimming it a little here so it looks a bit neater on camera. Normally, I leave those outer edges alone until the very end. Now I'm getting the fabric ready for section 3, which is blue in my block. And here the process is exactly the same. Check the coverage, sew on the line, press, trim, and move on to the next piece. That's really the whole idea of FPP. Some patterns are very simple like this one, and some can have lots of tiny pieces. But the process stays the same all the way through. You sew on the line, press the seam, trim the excess, prepare the next fabric, and just keep going until the block is finished. My blue fabric is darker than the pink, so here I can line the fabrics up edge to edge without worrying about the darker fabric showing through. I do press every seam, even on patterns with lots of sections. A lot depends on the fabric you're using. Most of the time I sew with very basic cotton from my local fabric shop, and I'm not always sure how it's going to behave. So pressing each seam with the iron just feels a little safer for me. If your fabric holds a finger press well, that can be enough too. This is simply the method I'm most comfortable with. Once all the sections are in place and the seams are nice and flat, it's time for the final trim. Now I trim away all the excess fabric right on the printed outer line. It does create a lot of scraps, and that part is true. But it's also a really good way to use fabric leftovers that are already too small for a full quilt project. And I save even the tiniest pieces. Bigger scraps can go into crazy quilting, and the really small ones I use for little scrap-pieced projects like this. Here's one small block I made from my tiniest leftovers. I arranged them into a simple little landscape, and I'm planning to turn it into either a zip pouch or a small fabric basket. The hand-drawn template on notebook paper doesn't have outer seam allowances built in. So here, I trim the fabric a 1/4 inch away from the paper on all sides, and that becomes my seam allowance. I don't remove the paper until the very end. First, I decide on the layout, join the blocks into the size I need, and only then do I tear the paper away. I actually like storing the blocks with the paper still on until I know exactly what I want to make with them. For these small blocks, I already know what I want to make. They're going to become a pillow cover for a sofa cushion. So I joined the blocks together, added extra fabric around the edges, and now this piece is ready for the next steps. And very soon, I'll show how I turn this panel into a finished pillow cover, how I remove the paper, how I quilt it, and how I finish the whole project. Thank you so much for watching. I'm still learning how to film this kind of process, but I really wanted to show everything as clearly and honestly as I could. I'll keep sharing more videos and showing each project from the first seams all the way to the finished result.